In tonight's journey through the ancient world, we leave behind the marble temples, triumphant generals, and glittering monuments of Rome to explore a very different story, one that history often overlooks. While emperors ruled vast territories and wealthy citizens enjoyed the luxuries of the greatest empire the world had ever known, millions of people lived lives that were anything but glorious. Hidden beneath the splendor of Rome was a vast population of enslaved men, women, and children whose labor helped build the empire itself. Their names were rarely recorded. Their stories were seldom told. Yet they formed the foundation upon which Roman society stood. Tonight, we will follow the tragic life of one such individual, not as a famous historical figure, but as an ordinary slave whose experiences reflected the reality faced by countless others across the Roman world. As you settle in and relax, imagine yourself traveling back nearly 2,000 years. The streets around you are crowded with merchants, soldiers, laborers, and noble citizens. The smell of fresh bread drifts from nearby bakeries. Marble buildings rise above bustling marketplaces. Fountains sparkle beneath the Mediterranean sun. To many, Rome appears magnificent, but for a slave, the city looks very different. Every corner of life is shaped by uncertainty. Freedom is a distant dream. A person's future can be bought, sold, traded, or taken away at the whim of another. Tonight, we will trace a life from its earliest beginnings to its final days. We will witness childhood interrupted by tragedy, long journeys across unfamiliar lands, years of labor, moments of friendship, small acts of hope, and the constant struggle to preserve one's humanity in a world that considered slaves to be property rather than people. Along the way, we will explore what daily life was truly like inside Roman households, farms, mines, workshops, and cities. We will discover how slaves worked, what they ate, where they slept, what punishments they feared, and what dreams they carried within their hearts. Yet this is not merely a story of suffering. It is also a story of endurance. Throughout history, ordinary people have demonstrated remarkable resilience even in the most difficult circumstances. The enslaved people of ancient Rome were no exception. Despite unimaginable hardships, many found ways to build friendships, create families, preserve traditions, and hold on to hope. Their lives remind us that human dignity can survive even when freedom does not. So dim the lights, settle comfortably beneath your blankets, and allow the noise of the modern world to slowly fade away. Let the distant sounds of ancient Rome replace it, the echo of footsteps on stone streets, the murmur of crowded marketplaces, the creaking of ships crossing the Mediterranean Sea, and the crackling of evening fires beneath a dark Roman sky. As your eyes grow heavier and your breathing becomes slower, prepare to step into a forgotten life hidden beneath the grandeur of an empire. Tonight, we begin the tragic story of an ancient Roman slave. Long before he became a slave, before chains, markets, and masters entered his life, he was simply a child. He lived in a small village far from the city of Rome, in a world that felt peaceful and familiar. His family farmed the land just as their ancestors had done for generations. The days followed a rhythm shaped by the seasons. Spring brought new growth to the fields. Summer filled the air with warmth and the scent of grain. Autumn meant harvest, while winter gathered everyone around the fire as cold winds swept across the countryside. To the young boy, the world seemed simple and predictable. He helped his parents with small tasks, chased animals through the fields, and listened to stories told by elders beneath the evening sky. He knew little about politics, empires, or wars. Rome was merely a distant name occasionally mentioned by traveling merchants. He could not have imagined that the decisions of powerful men hundreds of miles away would someday destroy everything he knew. As the years passed, rumors began reaching the village. Travelers spoke of Roman armies moving through neighboring regions. Some villages surrendered peacefully, others resisted. The adults discussed these developments in hushed voices, careful not to alarm the children. Yet the boy noticed the growing concern on his father's face. He noticed how conversations stopped whenever children approached. Something was changing. The world beyond the village was moving closer. One summer morning, that distant world finally arrived. The villagers awoke to smoke rising on the horizon. Soon afterward came the sound of shouting. Armed soldiers marched toward the settlement. Some villagers attempted to flee while others tried desperately to defend their homes. Chaos erupted almost instantly. The boy remembered little of the fighting itself. What remained in his memory were fragments. The screams, the flames, the confusion, the desperate search for his family among crowds of frightened people. Within hours, the village that had once felt permanent was gone. Homes burned, fields were trampled, lives were shattered. Many adults were killed, others were captured. The boy was among those taken alive. As evening fell, ropes bound the prisoners together. They sat beneath armed guards watching smoke drift into the darkening sky. Somewhere beyond the flames lay the remains of the only home he had ever known. He did not know whether his parents were alive. He did not know where he was being taken. He did not even understand why this had happened. All he knew was that his old life had ended. The next morning, the march began. The prisoners traveled for days through unfamiliar landscapes. Hunger and exhaustion became constant companions. Some captives tried to escape. Few succeeded. The Roman soldiers maintained strict discipline and showed little sympathy. To them, these prisoners were no longer people with families, memories, and dreams. They were valuable property, goods to be transported and eventually sold. As the journey continued, the boy gradually realized a terrifying truth. He would never return home. The fields where he once played, the family he loved, the life he had known. All of it was slipping further away with every step. Ahead lay an uncertain future in a world where freedom could be bought and sold like any other commodity. For the first time in his young life, he felt completely powerless. And this was only the beginning of his story. After weeks of marching across unfamiliar roads, the young prisoner finally caught his first glimpse of a major Roman city. Massive stone walls rose in the distance. Towers overlooked crowded streets. Wagons moved constantly through the gates while merchants, soldiers, and travelers filled the roads leading inward. To many visitors, such a city would have seemed magnificent. To the frightened boy, it felt overwhelming. Everything was larger than anything he had ever imagined. The noise alone was enough to make his head spin. He had grown up surrounded by open fields and quiet countryside. Now he found himself entering a world of stone, crowds, and endless activity. Yet he was not brought into the city as a visitor. He arrived as property. The prisoners were led toward a slave market where buyers gathered to inspect human beings just as they would inspect livestock. The boy stood among dozens of other captives beneath the hot Mediterranean sun. Men, women, and children waited anxiously while traders shouted prices and described the qualities of each person for sale. Some buyers examined muscles and teeth. Others asked questions about age, health, or skills. The experience was humiliating and terrifying. For the first time, the boy understood that his life now belonged to someone else. Eventually, a wealthy Roman merchant stopped in front of him. The man looked him over carefully. The boy was young, healthy, and appeared strong enough for years of labor. After a brief negotiation, money changed hands. Just like that, ownership transferred from one person to another. The merchant barely spoke to him. To the buyer, this was a routine transaction. To the boy, it was a moment that would shape the rest of his life. He was taken to a large household located near the center of the city. Compared to the village he had lost, the house seemed enormous. Marble floors reflected sunlight streaming through open courtyards. Decorative statues stood in carefully maintained gardens. Servants moved constantly through the halls carrying food, water, and supplies. The merchant's family lived in comfort, supported by a small army of enslaved workers. Some prepared meals, others cleaned rooms, maintained the property, cared for animals, or assisted with business matters. The boy quickly learned that every slave occupied a specific place within this complex system. During his first days, he rarely spoke. He observed everything carefully, trying to understand the rules of his new world. Mistakes could lead to punishment. Obedience offered safety. An older slave eventually took pity on him and explained the household routines. Wake before sunrise. Complete assigned tasks without complaint. Avoid attracting negative attention. Learn quickly. Survive. The advice was simple but essential. That first night, the boy slept on a thin straw mattress in a crowded servants' room beneath the main house. Around him, other slaves rested after long days of labor. Some whispered quietly before falling asleep. Others stared silently into the darkness. The boy listened to unfamiliar voices and thought about the life he had lost. Somewhere beyond the city walls lay the remains of his village. Somewhere, perhaps, members of his family still lived. Yet those possibilities felt distant and unreachable. Above him, the wealthy family slept comfortably in spacious rooms decorated with fine furniture and expensive artwork. Below, the slaves rested wherever space allowed. Both groups lived under the same roof, yet their worlds could not have been more different. As exhaustion finally pulled him towards sleep, the young slave realized that he had entered a society built upon divisions he barely understood. Some people commanded, others obeyed. Some possessed freedom, others belonged to someone else. And for now, he was firmly trapped among the latter. The young slave quickly learned that life inside a Roman household followed a strict routine. Before dawn, while much of the city still slept, slaves were already awake. The day began with work and often ended with work. There were floors to clean, water to carry, animals to feed, supplies to organize, and countless tasks that kept the household running smoothly. Every movement was watched. Every mistake could have consequences. At first, the boy struggled to keep up. He was unfamiliar with Roman customs and barely understood the language spoken around him. Simple instructions often confused him. Older slaves sometimes helped, but patience was limited. Everyone had responsibilities, and failure by one person could create problems for many others. The boy soon realized that survival depended on learning quickly. Over time, he began picking up words and phrases. He learned where different tools were stored, how meals were prepared, and how to avoid angering supervisors. Yet even as he adapted, he could never forget his position. He was not an employee. He was not a servant who could leave if treated unfairly. He was property. Every aspect of his existence depended upon the decisions of his owner. One afternoon, he witnessed a lesson that would remain with him for years. A slave working in the kitchen accidentally dropped an expensive ceramic vessel imported from a distant province. The room fell silent as the shattered pieces scattered across the floor. Everyone understood what might follow. The household overseer arrived moments later. The punishment was swift and public. The purpose was not simply to discipline the individual responsible. It was to remind every slave in the household of their vulnerability. The young boy watched silently, feeling fear settle deep within him. From that day forward, he became extremely cautious. He worked carefully. He spoke only when necessary. He learned to make himself nearly invisible. Yet, despite the harsh realities of slavery, moments of humanity still existed. During evening meals, slaves often gathered together after completing their duties. They shared stories, exchanged memories, and spoke about places they once called home. Many came from different regions of the empire. Some had been born into slavery. Others, like the boy, had been captured during wars or raids. Their backgrounds varied, but their circumstances united them. It was during these evenings that he formed his first real friendships since losing his family. An older slave from Greece taught him new words and explained Roman customs. A young woman from Gaul shared stories about the forests of her homeland. Another slave who worked in the gardens occasionally brought extra fruit to share with friends. These small acts of kindness might seem insignificant, but within the harsh world of slavery, they carried enormous meaning. They reminded people that they were still human, that they still possessed dignity, memories, and emotions no master could fully control. As months turned into years, the boy slowly transformed into a young man. His childhood memories became less vivid. The faces of his parents grew harder to recall. The village of his birth began to feel almost like a dream. Yet he never stopped thinking about freedom. Sometimes, while carrying supplies through the bustling streets of the city, he would watch free citizens moving wherever they wished. They chose their work. They made their own decisions. They belonged to themselves. Such freedoms seemed ordinary to them. To the slave, they appeared almost magical. Every day he wondered if he might someday experience them as well. But in ancient Rome, hope could be both a source of strength and a source of pain. And he was about to discover just how fragile hope could become. As the years passed, the young slave became one of the most dependable workers in the household. He had learned the language, understood the routines, and rarely made mistakes. His owner began trusting him with more responsibilities. He was sometimes sent into the city on errands, carrying messages or delivering goods for the merchant's business. To an outsider, this might have seemed like a sign of improvement. Compared to the brutal labor performed by slaves in mines or large agricultural estates, his life appeared relatively comfortable. Yet comfort and freedom were not the same thing. Every privilege he enjoyed could disappear at any moment. Every task was performed under the authority of someone else. The invisible chains of slavery remained firmly in place. During his journeys through the city, he saw many different sides of Roman life. He passed grand temples decorated with marble columns. He watched wealthy senators travel through crowded streets surrounded by servants and guards. He saw gladiator advertisements painted onto walls and heard excited crowds discussing upcoming games. Rome seemed endless. It was a city filled with opportunity for some and suffering for others. The slave noticed how people often ignored those at the bottom of society. Beggars sat beside roads. Laborers carried heavy loads through the heat. Slaves hurried from one task to another. Most citizens walked past without giving them a second glance. To many Romans, such sights were simply part of daily life. One afternoon, while delivering supplies to another household, he met a young enslaved woman around his own age. Their conversation lasted only a few moments, but something about it stayed with him. She had been born into slavery and had never known any other life. Unlike him, she had no memories of freedom. Yet despite her circumstances, she possessed a quiet optimism that surprised him. Over the following months, their paths crossed several times. Sometimes they exchanged only a few words. Sometimes they spoke longer when opportunity allowed. Their conversations became one of the brightest parts of his life. For the first time in many years, he felt something beyond fear and survival. He felt companionship, perhaps even hope. Together they imagined impossible futures. What would freedom feel like? Where would they go if they could leave Rome behind? Would they return to distant homelands or start entirely new lives? Such conversations were dangerous because they encouraged dreams that reality rarely allowed. Yet dreams were difficult to resist. For enslaved people, imagination often provided the only escape available. The young man began looking forward to every chance meeting. In a life controlled by others, these brief moments felt precious. But the world of ancient Rome was unpredictable. Slaves could be sold, transferred, or separated without warning. Their wishes mattered very little. One morning, after several weeks without seeing her, he learned the truth. Her owner had sold her to a wealthy family in another province. She was gone. There had been no farewell, no opportunity to say goodbye. One day she was part of his life. The next she had vanished completely. The news struck him harder than he expected. Once again, slavery had reminded him of its cruelest reality. It did not merely take freedom. It took stability, certainty, and sometimes even the people one cared about most. As he returned to his duties that evening, the streets of Rome seemed colder than before. The city remained as busy and magnificent as ever, but for him, something important had been lost. And deep inside, he began wondering whether true happiness was possible for someone whose entire life could be changed by another person's decision. Years continued to pass, and the young slave entered adulthood. By now, he knew the rhythms of Roman life almost as well as any free citizen. He could navigate the crowded streets, negotiate simple business matters for his master, and carry out responsibilities that required trust and experience. To many observers, he seemed fortunate compared to countless other slaves scattered throughout the empire. He lived inside a wealthy household, received regular meals, and avoided the backbreaking labor of mines and plantations. Yet appearances often concealed deeper truths. No matter how skilled or reliable he became, he remained someone else's property. Every achievement belonged not to him, but to the man who owned him. One summer, his master expanded his trading business and began traveling more frequently between cities. As a result, the slave was assigned additional duties. He supervised younger slaves, managed deliveries, and occasionally handled transactions in local markets. These responsibilities brought him into contact with merchants, sailors, craftsmen, and travelers from every corner of the Roman world. Through their stories, he gained a broader understanding of the empire. He heard tales of distant deserts, snowy mountains, bustling ports, and foreign cultures. The Roman Empire seemed endless. Yet no matter how far these travelers journeyed, they enjoyed something he lacked: the ability to choose their destination. During this period, he also witnessed the harsh realities faced by slaves less fortunate than himself. Whenever he accompanied his master to rural estates outside the city, he He saw enormous agricultural properties worked by hundreds of laborers. Under the blazing sun, men and women toiled from dawn until dusk. Their work was exhausting and relentless. Some spent entire days harvesting crops. Others dug irrigation channels or cared for livestock. The conditions were far harsher than those within urban households. Many workers appeared exhausted long before reaching old age. Seeing their struggles filled him with conflicting emotions. He felt sympathy for them, but also guilt for recognizing that his own situation could have been much worse. One evening, while visiting a large estate, he met an elderly slave who had spent nearly 50 years in servitude. The old man moved slowly, his body worn down by decades of labor, yet his mind remained sharp. As they spoke beside a small fire after sunset, the elder shared stories from his long life. He had been captured during a war in his youth, much like the younger man. He had spent decades hoping for freedom, believing each year might be the one that changed everything. Eventually, however, he learned a difficult lesson. Hope alone was not enough. The old slave spoke quietly as the fire crackled between them. He explained that many enslaved people spent their entire lives waiting for a future that never arrived. Some dreamed of escape. Others hoped their masters would grant freedom. Many clung to promises that were never fulfilled. "Do not spend your whole life waiting," the old man warned. "If happiness comes, take it when you find it. Life is shorter than you think." Those words lingered in the younger man's mind long after he returned to the city. For years, he had focused on survival and the distant possibility of freedom. Yet he rarely allowed himself to appreciate the small moments that still existed within his difficult life. The friendships, the quiet evenings, the satisfaction of meaningful work, the beauty of a sunset over the rooftops of Rome. These things did not erase his suffering, but they reminded him that life contained more than hardship alone. As autumn arrived and cooler winds swept through the city, he found himself reflecting more often on the old man's advice. Freedom remained his greatest dream, but perhaps he could not allow that dream to become the only thing that mattered. Perhaps survival required more than endurance. Perhaps it also required finding reasons to keep living in the present. It was a realization that would shape the years ahead, though he could not yet know how important it would become. As the years moved forward, the slave became one of the most trusted members of the household. His master valued reliability above all else, and few slaves had proven themselves as dependable. This trust brought small privileges. He was allowed greater freedom of movement within the city, handled important deliveries, and occasionally accompanied business expeditions to nearby towns. To a casual observer, these opportunities might have looked like signs of advancement. In some ways they were. Yet trust could be a complicated thing in the Roman world. A trusted slave was still a slave. The boundaries remained invisible but absolute. During one business journey, he traveled farther from Rome than he had in many years. The road stretched across rolling hills, vineyards, and farming estates. Villages appeared and disappeared along the horizon. For a brief moment, as he rode beside a wagon carrying goods for his master, he experienced a strange sensation. The countryside reminded him of his childhood. The open fields, the scent of earth after rain, the distant sound of birds, all of it awakened memories he thought had faded forever. That evening, the group stopped at a roadside inn. Merchants gathered around fires discussing trade routes and politics. Travelers exchanged stories from distant provinces. Sitting quietly nearby, the slave listened. One elderly traveler spoke of lands beyond the empire's borders, places where Roman authority held little influence. Another described communities of escaped slaves who had vanished into remote mountains. Most listeners dismissed such stories as exaggerations. Yet the slave found himself captivated. For years he had accepted the limits of his existence. Freedom had become an abstract dream rather than a realistic goal. But hearing these stories stirred something deep within him. For the first time in many years, he allowed himself to imagine escape. The thought was both exciting and terrifying. He knew the risks. Rome treated runaway slaves harshly. Captured fugitives often faced brutal punishment designed to discourage others from attempting the same. Some were branded, others were beaten. A few suffered even worse fates. The empire depended heavily on enslaved labor, and authorities showed little mercy toward those who challenged the system. Still, the possibility lingered in his thoughts. As the journey continued over the following weeks, he paid closer attention to the world around him. He noticed mountain passes, forests, and isolated roads. He wondered how far a determined person could travel before being caught. He imagined leaving everything behind and disappearing into the vastness of the world. Yet every imagined escape eventually collided with reality. He had no money, no safe destination, no allies waiting beyond the empire's reach. Most importantly, he had responsibilities. Over the years, he had formed friendships with people inside the household. Some depended upon him. Others trusted him. Leaving would not simply mean risking his own life. It would mean abandoning those connections forever. One evening after returning to Rome, he climbed to the roof of a storage building overlooking the city. The sun was setting behind distant hills, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Below him stretched one of the greatest cities in human history. Temples gleamed in the fading light. Smoke rose from thousands of homes. Crowds moved through streets that seemed endless. Somewhere within that immense city lived senators, merchants, soldiers, laborers, slaves, and countless others, each carrying their own hopes and fears. As he watched darkness slowly settle across the rooftops, he realized something important. Freedom was not merely the absence of chains. It was the ability to choose one's own path, to decide where to go, whom to love, what work to pursue, and how to spend one's days. These were choices most free citizens barely considered. Yet to him, they represented the most precious things imaginable. He remained on the rooftop long after nightfall, staring toward the horizon. The possibility of escape had entered his mind, and once planted, such ideas were difficult to remove. He did not know whether he would ever act upon them, but for the first time in years, the future seemed uncertain again. And uncertainty, while frightening, also carried the faintest hint of hope. The idea of freedom remained with him long after that journey ended. He never spoke about it openly, but it lingered in the quiet corners of his mind. As he carried out his daily responsibilities, supervised younger slaves, and moved through the crowded streets of Rome, he often found himself wondering what life would feel like if every decision belonged to him alone. The thought was both comforting and painful. Comforting because it offered hope. Painful because it seemed so far beyond reach. Yet life continued, and the demands of each day left little time for dreams. The years passed steadily. The young slave was no longer young. Lines began to appear on his face. His body, once filled with endless energy, now carried the weight of decades of labor. Though he remained strong and capable, he could feel time moving forward in ways he had never noticed before. One day, while helping organize business records for his master, he overheard a conversation that changed everything. The merchant had grown older as well. His health was beginning to decline, and discussions about inheritance had become increasingly common within the household. Family members debated property, finances, and future responsibilities. Among these discussions was a subject that immediately caught the slave's attention: manumission, the formal granting of freedom to a slave. In Roman society, some masters chose to free loyal slaves after many years of service. It was never guaranteed, but it happened often enough to keep hope alive among those who served faithfully. For days afterward, he thought about little else. Could this be his chance? Had his years of loyalty finally brought him closer to the future he had imagined for so long? He tried not to become consumed by expectation. He had seen disappointment destroy people before, yet hope returned with a strength he had not felt since childhood. Weeks turned into months. Every conversation involving the merchant's health seemed significant. Every discussion about the future drew his attention. Then one evening he received unexpected news. His master wished to speak with him privately. The request filled him with nervous anticipation. Inside the merchant's study, surrounded by shelves of scrolls and records accumulated over a lifetime of business, the aging master spoke calmly. He thanked the slave for decades of faithful service. He acknowledged his honesty, reliability, and hard work. Then, after a pause that seemed to last forever, he revealed his decision. Upon the merchant's death, the slave would be granted his freedom. For a moment, the room seemed to fall silent. The words were difficult to comprehend. Freedom, the dream that had accompanied him for most of his life, suddenly felt real. Yet the announcement brought unexpected emotions. Relief, certainly. Gratitude, perhaps. But also sadness. The freedom he had long desired would arrive only after the death of a man he had served for decades. Their relationship had never been equal, yet it had shaped nearly every aspect of his adult life. Walking back to his room that evening, he found himself overwhelmed by conflicting thoughts. For years, freedom had existed as a distant possibility. Now it stood waiting somewhere ahead, closer than ever before, yet still not fully his. As he lay awake that night listening to the familiar sounds of the household, he realized that the next chapter of his life was approaching. The question was no longer whether freedom could happen. The question was what he would do when it finally arrived. The months following his master's promise felt different from any period he had experienced before. For most of his life, the future had been controlled entirely by others. Now, for the first time, he could see a path that might eventually belong to him. Freedom was no longer an impossible dream whispered about in the darkness. It had become a real possibility waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Yet waiting proved more difficult than he expected. Each day seemed longer than the last. Every morning he woke wondering whether the moment that would change his life had drawn any closer. At the same time, he continued performing his duties exactly as before. The household still required management. Deliveries still needed to be completed. Younger slaves still depended on his guidance. Outwardly, nothing had changed. Inwardly, everything had. The aging merchant's health continued to decline. Some days he appeared strong enough to conduct business as usual. On other days, he rarely left his room. Physicians came and went carrying herbs, medicines, and advice. Family members spent increasing amounts of time discussing inheritance and future arrangements. The atmosphere throughout the household gradually shifted. Everyone understood that an era was coming to an end. One autumn evening, as golden sunlight faded beyond the rooftops of Rome, the merchant passed away peacefully. The news spread quickly through the household. Family members mourned. Servants whispered quietly among themselves. Business associates arrived to offer condolences. Amid all the sadness and uncertainty, the slave found himself standing at a crossroads he had imagined for decades. Several weeks later, legal matters were finalized. The merchant's final wishes were read aloud. True to his promise, freedom was granted. A formal document confirmed it. The law now recognized him as a free man. No chains fell from his wrists. No dramatic celebration followed. Yet everything had changed. After so many years, he belonged to himself. The moment felt almost unreal. For days, he struggled to understand what freedom actually meant. No one assigned his tasks. No one ordered him where to go. No one possessed legal ownership over his future. The possibilities were overwhelming. For much of his life, decisions had been made for him. Now every choice rested in his own hands. At first, this freedom felt strangely uncomfortable. He had spent decades living within strict routines. Suddenly those routines were gone. Yet with each passing day, he began discovering simple joys that free people often take for granted. He walked through the city without carrying out someone else's instructions. He chose where to spend his time. He lingered in marketplaces, visited temples, and sat beside fountains simply because he wished to. These ordinary experiences felt extraordinary. One morning, while standing atop a hill overlooking Rome, he watched sunlight spread across the city. The same streets, buildings, and crowds remained below, yet everything looked different. For years, he had viewed the world through the eyes of a slave. Now he saw it through the eyes of a free man. The feeling was difficult to describe. It was not happiness alone. It was not relief alone. It was something deeper, a sense of ownership over his own existence. Yet even as he embraced freedom, he understood a painful truth. The years lost to slavery could never be returned. His childhood was gone. His family remained lost to history. Entire decades had passed under the control of others. Freedom had arrived, but it had arrived late. Standing beneath the bright Roman sky, he reflected upon the strange journey that had brought him here. He had survived war, captivity, hardship, loss, and uncertainty. Many others had not been so fortunate. And as he looked toward the future, he realized that his story was entering its final chapter. Not as a slave, but as a man finally free to decide how the rest of his life would be lived. Freedom brought possibilities he had once believed impossible, yet it also brought challenges he had never anticipated. For decades, nearly every aspect of his life had been structured by the household where he served. Meals appeared at predictable times. Tasks filled each day. A place to sleep was guaranteed. As a free man, those certainties vanished. He now had to build a life for himself in a city that had changed dramatically since the frightened boy first arrived there in chains. Rome remained vast, crowded, and full of opportunity, but opportunity often favored those who possessed wealth, family connections, or social status. He possessed none of these things. What he did have was experience, discipline, and knowledge gained through a lifetime of service. Using a small sum of money left to him by his former master, he rented a modest room near a busy commercial district. The room was small, containing little more than a bed, a table, and a single window overlooking a narrow street. Yet every part of it belonged to him. For the first time in his life, he could close a door and know that the space beyond it was his own. That simple realization filled him with quiet satisfaction. He found work assisting merchants with deliveries and records, tasks he had mastered during his years in the household. The pay was modest, but it was his. Each coin he earned represented his own labor rather than someone else's profit. As the months passed, he began forming connections with other freedmen. Rome contained many former slaves who had successfully built new lives after manumission. Some became craftsmen. Others opened shops, worked as clerks, or managed businesses. Their stories inspired him. They proved that freedom could be more than a legal status, could become a meaningful life. Yet he also noticed something else. Many freedmen carried invisible scars from their years in bondage. Though legally free, they often struggled to escape the habits and fears developed during slavery. Some still lowered their eyes when speaking to wealthy citizens. Others hesitated before making decisions, accustomed to seeking permission from someone else. He recognized these tendencies within himself as well. One afternoon, while walking through a marketplace, he encountered a group of children playing near a fountain. Their laughter echoed through the square as they chased one another beneath the warm Mediterranean sun. The sight unexpectedly stirred memories he had not visited in years. He remembered running through fields near his childhood village. He remembered his mother's voice calling him home before sunset. He remembered a life that had ended so abruptly. For a long moment, he simply stood there watching the children. Then he realized something important. Although slavery had stolen much from him, it had not destroyed every part of who he was. The boy he once had been still existed somewhere within him. As he grew older, thoughts of the past visited him more frequently. He often wondered what had become of his family. Were any of them still alive? Had they survived the attack that destroyed their village? Such questions had no answers. The empire was simply too vast, and too much time had passed. Yet instead of causing only sadness, these memories now brought a strange sense of peace. He had spent years mourning what was lost. Now he found himself grateful for what remained. He had survived. He had endured. Against overwhelming odds, he had lived long enough to experience freedom. The realization did not erase the tragedies of his past, but it changed how he viewed them. Life had not unfolded as he once imagined. It had been harder, crueler, and far more uncertain. Yet it had also contained moments of kindness, friendship, resilience, and hope. As he walked home through the fading light of evening, he felt a quiet contentment settle over him. For the first time in many years, he was not looking backward with regret or forward with longing. He was simply grateful to be alive, free beneath the same sky that had watched over him since childhood. As the years continued to pass, the former slave entered old age. His hair, once dark, gradually turned silver. The strength that had carried him through decades of labor slowly faded. Tasks that once seemed effortless now required patience and care. Yet, unlike many years of his earlier life, these changes no longer frightened him. He had spent so much of his existence struggling merely to survive that growing old felt almost like a privilege. Many of the people he had known throughout his life never reached this stage. Some had died in slavery. Others had fallen victim to illness, war, or hardship. He had outlived them all and lived long enough to witness something he once believed impossible: his own freedom. Rome itself continued to change around him. New buildings rose while older structures crumbled. Children grew into adults and raised families of their own. Emperors came and went. Political fortunes shifted. Merchants gained wealth and lost it again. The empire moved forward just as it always had. Yet, from the perspective of an aging man, these changes seemed strangely distant. He spent less time chasing opportunity and more time observing the world around him. Mornings often began with quiet walks through familiar streets. He greeted shopkeepers who knew him by name. He sat beside fountains listening to conversations carried on the breeze. He watched sunlight illuminate marble temples and reflected upon how many years had passed since he first entered the city as a frightened captive. One evening, while sitting outside a small tavern, he met a young laborer recently arrived in Rome. The young man complained about his difficult circumstances, uncertain future, and endless responsibilities. Listening to him, the former slave could not help but smile. He remembered feeling much the same way when he was younger. The two spoke for hours. Eventually, the young laborer asked what advice an old man might offer after such a long life. The question lingered in the air for a moment before he answered. He spoke not of wealth, power, or success. Instead, he spoke about resilience. He explained that life rarely unfolds according to one's plans. Sometimes everything familiar can disappear in a single day. Sometimes years of hardship seem impossible to endure. Yet people often possess greater strength than they realize. He had learned that survival was not simply about physical endurance. It was about protecting hope even when circumstances offered little reason for optimism. It was about finding meaning in small acts of kindness, friendship, and perseverance. Most importantly, it was about continuing forward when giving up would seem easier. The young laborer listened carefully. Perhaps he understood the deeper meaning behind those words. Perhaps he simply saw an old man sharing stories. Either way, the conversation left a lasting impression on both of them. As darkness settled across the city and the tavern lanterns flickered to life, the former slave realized something important. His story was no longer only his own. The lessons learned through suffering and endurance could continue through others. In a way, that was its own form of legacy. Walking home beneath the stars that evening, he thought about the long path that had brought him here. From a peaceful village destroyed by war to the slave markets of Rome, through decades of servitude, loss, hope, and eventual freedom. The journey had been painful beyond measure, yet it had also revealed the remarkable capacity of the human spirit to endure. As he reached the door of his modest home and looked one final time toward the lights of the city, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not because life had been easy, but because despite everything, he had lived it. And that realization filled the aging man with a quiet peace that no master, empire, or hardship could ever take away. In the final years of his life, the former slave found himself spending more time with memories than with plans. The future no longer stretched endlessly before him as it once had. Instead, his thoughts often wandered backward through the decades. He remembered faces long gone, voices that had faded into silence, and places that existed now only within his mind. Sometimes these memories arrived unexpectedly while he walked through the city. A familiar scent from a bakery might remind him of his childhood village. The sight of farmers arriving at market could bring back images of his father working the fields. Even the sound of children laughing in distant streets sometimes transported him across the years to a life that had ended long ago. Yet these memories no longer carried the same pain they once had. Time had softened many wounds. The loss remained, but the bitterness had faded. Instead of focusing on everything that had been taken from him, he found himself appreciating everything he had experienced. Few people were given the opportunity to witness such dramatic changes within a single lifetime. He had known freedom, captivity, suffering, friendship, hope, despair, and redemption. He had seen both the cruelty and kindness that human beings were capable of showing one another. In many ways, his life had revealed the full range of the human experience. As age continued to slow him down, he became something of a familiar figure in his neighborhood. Shopkeepers greeted him warmly. Children often listened to his stories with fascination. Younger workers sometimes stopped to seek advice. Though he possessed neither wealth nor influence, people respected him. They saw wisdom in his calm demeanor and gentle outlook on life. Few knew the full story of what he had endured. Yet somehow, the strength gained through those experiences seemed visible in the way he carried himself. One autumn afternoon, he sat beneath the shade of a tree overlooking a quiet section of the city. The air was cool, and golden leaves drifted slowly to the ground around him. Nearby, citizens moved through their daily routines just as they always had. Watching them, he reflected on one of the greatest lessons his life had taught him. Empires rise and fall. Wealth comes and goes. Power shifts constantly from one person to another. Yet ordinary lives are what truly shape history. The farmers, laborers, merchants, mothers, children, and even slaves who rarely appear in official records often carry the greatest stories of all. For much of his life, he had believed his experiences were insignificant compared to the achievements of emperors and generals. But age brought perspective. He now understood that every life mattered. Every struggle mattered. Every act of courage, kindness, and perseverance mattered. History was not built solely by famous names carved into monuments. It was also built by countless ordinary people whose stories were never written down. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the city, he felt an unexpected sense of completion. There were still questions that would never be answered. He would never know what became of his family. He would never see the village of his childhood again. Yet he no longer felt burdened by those mysteries. Some things belonged to the past. What mattered now was the life he had managed to build despite everything that had happened. Slowly rising from the bench, he began the familiar walk home. The streets glowed softly beneath the evening light. Around him, life continued much as it always would. And as he moved through the city one final time as an old man at peace with his journey, he carried with him a quiet understanding. Even the most tragic life can contain meaning, and even the most forgotten person can leave behind a story worth remembering. As winter settled over Rome, the former slave sensed that the final chapter of his life was approaching. The city he had known for so many decades continued to move with its usual rhythm. Merchants opened their shops at dawn. Children played in narrow streets. Citizens debated politics in crowded forums. Life carried on just as it always had. Yet for him, time seemed to move differently now. His steps had grown slower. His body tired more easily. Simple tasks required more effort than before. Still, he faced these changes with remarkable calm. After everything he had endured throughout his life, old age felt less like a burden and more like a final gift. Many evenings were spent sitting beside a small fire, watching shadows dance across the walls of his modest home. During those quiet hours, memories often returned. He remembered the village of his childhood. He remembered the smoke rising above the horizon on the day everything changed. He remembered the slave market, the years of labor, the friendships he had formed, and the freedom he eventually gained. The memories arrived not as painful wounds, but as pieces of a long journey. Together they formed the story of a life that had survived against overwhelming odds. One particularly cold evening, rain tapped softly against the roof while the city outside settled into silence. Sitting near the fire, he reflected on the strange path his life had taken. As a child, he could never have imagined the future that awaited him. The world had shown him cruelty, loss, and suffering, yet it had also shown him compassion, friendship, resilience, and hope. Looking back, he realized that neither joy nor sorrow had defined his life completely. Instead, it was endurance that connected every chapter together. The simple decision to keep moving forward, one day at a time, had carried him through every hardship. In the weeks that followed, his health gradually declined. Friends and neighbors visited often. Some brought food. Others simply sat beside him and shared conversation. Their presence reminded him that he was no longer alone in the world. The frightened boy who had once lost everything had become an old man surrounded by respect and kindness. It was a transformation he could never have predicted. Then, one peaceful morning, as sunlight filtered gently through the window, his long journey came to an end. There was no grand ceremony, no famous audience, no monument waiting to preserve his name. The empire continued around him, unaware that one ordinary life had quietly reached its conclusion. Yet that did not make his story any less important, because in truth, the story of this former slave was never only about one man. It was the story of millions whose names have been forgotten by history. Men, women, and children who lived, struggled, hoped, loved, and endured beneath the vast machinery of the Roman Empire. Their lives rarely appeared in official records. Their achievements were seldom celebrated. Yet they existed, they mattered, and without them, the world they helped build could never have existed. As the years passed and generations came and went, his name disappeared from memory. The house where he lived vanished. The streets he walked changed. Even the empire that once seemed eternal eventually faded into history. But the lessons of his life remained. The strength to endure hardship, the courage to hold on to hope, the ability to preserve humanity even when others try to take it away. These are qualities that transcend centuries. And so, as our journey through ancient Rome comes to an end, we leave behind the marble temples, crowded markets, and powerful emperors. Instead, we remember an ordinary man whose life reflected both the cruelty and resilience of the human experience. His story may have been tragic, but it was also extraordinary. Not because he became famous, wealthy, or powerful, but because he endured. Now, as the sounds of ancient Rome fade into the distance and the empire slowly disappears into the mists of history, allow yourself to rest. Let the echoes of forgotten lives drift gently away. And as sleep draws closer, remember that even the quietest lives can leave behind the deepest stories. Tonight, we say farewell to an ancient Roman slave whose name was lost to time, but whose journey will not be forgotten.